This study of cyberspace and the use of social networks mostly, I found it curious, a recent study by, of all people, an executive from Microsoft, who was put in charge of seeing how the young people use the internet, obviously for the benefit of Microsoft.
Yes.
And she made an interesting observation. That's an American executive. She says that the social networks are new representations of the class divide, at least in American youth, she says. You, as a sociologist, pay a lot of attention to social classes. What do you think of these observations?
Well, I think the first thing to say about that is that access to cyberspace, of course, cuts across class divides, in the sense that given what the minimum threshold is to be involved in something like Facebook or MySpace doesn't really require that much computer power nowadays, that you can come from virtually any social class and be involved in it. I mean, I think the thing that's sort of interesting, may turn out to be quite important in the long term, is the degree to which people can, as it were, exchange or trade their identities by entering into this new medium. So in other words, how do you give yourself away in cyberspace, given that most people are actually operating under assumed names, right? So people don't actually come already identified with their class markers. And in fact, I think one of the reasons why a lot of people find cyberspace so comforting is precisely the extent to which they can manage or manufacture new identities and in some sense transcend the ones that they would be normally associated with. I mean, and in this country, in Britain, this is very obvious from the way people sound, right? The way people speak is really indicative of class background, where class is strongly correlated with education, much more so than in the United States, where people sound more or less the same very often. And you can trade out of that, right, in cyberspace because your accent's not there.
As you mentioned, the kids today are more open to certain ideas in the scientific world because they see the cyborgs, and therefore they understand certain things better than the older generation does. By the same token, do you think that their dealings with the social networks, the Facebooks, the Twitters, and the things of this kind, tend to lead them towards a kind of social participation of a different way? Let me put it in different words. We used to think that social activism meant going out in the streets and demanding your rights, the civil rights movements and student protests of that kind. Do these kids move towards a different kind of demand in society?
Well, I think
different style.
Well, it's interesting, of course, because we in sociology we talk about the so-called new social movements, and I mean, I'll just get one way of addressing it is to look at the way in which the anti-globalization movement has been very integrally connected with these kinds of social networking things on the internet. But what you see is not quite the same phenomena as the old socialist movements or labor movements, in that what you see is rather kind of spontaneous eruptions. So most of the time, as it were, the movement is sort of underground, socially networking on the internet, but every now and then at certain key conferences or certain key moments, eruptions take place.
Of the old style.
Yes, exactly, but then they go underground again, right? So there isn't, as it were, a political party or a political movement in the traditional kind of Marxist sense that's kind of sustaining through the whole thing. It's rather these kind of seemingly spontaneous eruptions after a lot of incubation in cyberspace. Then all of a sudden you get these, riots taking place here and there, but then afterwards it all settles down again, and then people are still arguing and so forth, and then they erupt.
So when Copenhagen takes place,
yes,
and they go out and do it the old way.
That's right, but they really have. But all you need to do is to prevent them from being in the room where the decisions are made, and they have no effect at all. I mean, this is the big problem with this social networking stuff. In a sense, it really hasn't reconnected with a lot of the substance of traditional politics, which at the end of the day is about getting and being in the room, and forcing certain kinds of wording and certain kinds of binding sorts of agreements to be made and so forth. They haven't gotten there yet. What they've gotten is to a kind of simulated place, a place where they can kind of play politics, and it kind of parallels and mirrors what's actually going on in the place where the politics is really occurring. And what I worry about this kind of parallel universe that's being created is it becomes something like a safety valve where people let off steam, they feel quite righteous about themselves at the end of the day, but it has no discernible effect.
They think they're doing something, but in fact they're not.
Exactly. And that's the thing that worries me. And one wonders what the cumulative effect is. And typically the way you do see some kind of cumulative effect is that some of these people eventually wise up and go into conventional politics. Okay? And this is, of course, what happened to the student radicals in the 1960s, where in a sense they were actually much closer to real politics than the people nowadays are. Is that eventually some of these people will go into green parties and become, legislators in parliament and become parts of government and to a certain extent sell out. But nevertheless, that will be the way in which, they will have some substantive impact.
Because that's what they will do that, because that's where the real power is, those centers. Not the cyber world, but parliament and the conference hall.
For the time, yes, at least for the foreseeable future. I mean, one of the problems at the moment with cyberspace, you might say, is that we don't have any publicly recognized conceptions of power or value there. So in terms of what are you fighting for in cyberspace, it's not clear that has any kind of discernible real-world effect. I mean, and that's an interesting problem right there, because at least in the so-called real world of politics, you're arguing about votes, and votes, as it were, matters for elections, and elections matter because that's how you do policy, and there's a kind of causal chain there that's very carefully spelled out. The same thing with money as well. Money has certain kinds of discernible impacts, so being able to have large amounts of money enables you to do things that not having large amounts of money enable you to do. But in cyberspace, there's nothing quite comparable to that yet, in terms of either money or power as a kind of currency in which you can get things done in the world. And what you have to eventually do is somehow move into the conventional medium, because there is no natural translation point. There's no natural mode of exchange yet. And that's why it's very easy, I think, to think about cyberspace very often as kind of a safety valve, where people let off steam, let off emotion, feel kind of righteous, and feel sort of, that they've done something good, but not have any kind of effect at all. And at the end of the day, if you're talking about politics, you're talking about effect.
It's one of the criticisms along the lines of what you're saying about this overuse of cyberspace. It is said that the younger generation spends way too much time in this area instead of in so-called real life. You deal with younger people now as your students at university. Mm-hmm. Is that the reality? Is that what you see? They spend way too much time in cyber world?
I don't know if it's way too much time, because, see, to a large extent, a lot of knowledge and information that traditionally was in conventional medium like books has migrated into cyberspace. So, for example, if you want to, on a very mundane level, if you want to assign certain texts to students to read, if they're already online through journal subscriptions that the university has electronically, or books that are electronically available, that makes it much more easy for them and much more likely that they'll actually consult it, okay? And it'll be sort of presented in a way that they're used to dealing with, because they're so used to dealing with things in front of a computer screen. So that insofar as a lot of the conventional information sources have migrated to cyberspace, that's not so much of a problem. I think the bigger problem is the thing I've been alluding to with regard to the failure to translate cyberspace ideas into conventional notions of power. So in other words, what difference does it make, right? I mean, so if there was some way in which one could measure cyber power that in some way was translatable into real political power, then that would be interesting. And that would be something worth working on, I would think, from the standpoint of political scientists or economists or people of that kind. And I think that's what's lacking now. And so when I think about, students wasting their time on cyberspace, it's in that vein. Namely, that a lot of the time spent might end up quite literally just being recreational time. That it doesn't actually have a payoff in some other kind of realm. I think that's always a worry.
In cyberspace, nobody knows you're a proletarian.
Well, in principle, right? In principle, of course, there are telltale signs, in terms of the grammar of one's sentences. But of course, as cyberspace develops its own kind of hybrid lingua francas, right? Texting is a great example of this, where we're getting this sort of new kind of spelling taking place, that in a sense, those old class markers tied to verbal expression are being eradicated. Okay, and if anything, one of the things that you give away when you do write in so-called proper English is your age. right? You're old. You're pre-text. You're a pre-text person because you don't naturally communicate, in that kind of abbreviated text way.
Dinosaur.
Yes, exactly. So even when you try, you fail, right? But notice the markers are different. They're generational markers. They're not necessarily mapping directly onto the traditional class markers. So what I would say in general is, of course, you might say cyberspace provides a new opportunity to recreate class boundaries, but the basis on which those class boundaries are created are different, and different people will fall on different sides of these things. And then the question becomes, to what extent does that little world, that virtual world, then project onto the larger real world?
And so far we don't
know. We don't know.
The same way that we don't really know where old media is going to go, do it.
That's right. Yes, whether books will still be around.
At the moment, I think we're all gathering different opinions. What's your opinion where it's going?
Well, I do think there is let's put it this way, there is a real problem with the future of reading. Let's put it that way. Because I was mentioning earlier how all the print medium is gradually migrating into cyberspace. So now you can read most books online, or you soon will be able to read most books and most journal articles online. Perhaps you'll have to pay for it, but you'll be able to do it. But the problem is the nature of the reading activity is changing because of the medium. So it's not enough just to have the content there present. The question is how people are relating to the content. And that's something that's undergoing a massive sea change. And I think the way you see this is through this phenomenon of cut and paste, which is always, it's so easy to do through word processing, and it's reproduced on the web. And it becomes kind of the medium by which, in fact, people talk about texts. Okay, and so what happens is, first of all, you get a much more, you get a sort of higher degree of commentary. There isn't so much an interest in people originating their own text, because you can just start off by cutting and pasting something else and then talking around it. But then what's cut and pasted has typically been taken radically out of context, and often it's very difficult to find what the original context is. So what you end up getting are people who are making all kinds of judgments about what people are saying based on fairly limited amounts of information that nevertheless have a kind of objectivity because they've been cut and pasted from the original.
It sounds and it looks like it's solid information, but it may have no basis at all.
Exactly. And all you need is a couple of false hyperlinks.
It looks relevant, but it might not have any.
Well, that's right. And of course, as a thing, an interesting thing to do is to trace linkages, right? So here you have a cut and paste thing in front of you. You find other people pick up on it and start commenting it on too, especially on blogs. Following what blogs do is very interesting because they tend to imitate each other. But then if you try to do a hyperlink to go back to where the cut and paste thing originally came from, you often come up empty-handed, because the original cut and paste thing, right, was in a way very much manufactured. So in a way taken completely out of context. Often lots of sentences and things are removed. But after a while, it becomes this seemingly solid piece of information.
That's how you develop conspiracy theories of all kinds.
Yeah, well.
People start to believe references they see on the internet without actually going back to the basis, to the source. There is no real source. Somebody just put it up there and somebody copied and pasted it.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, Wikipedia is a very interesting kind of phenomenon in this respect. Because here's Wikipedia trying to become, and in general, I'm well disposed toward Wikipedia, because there's a very interesting project here about recreating the full body of human knowledge in this radically new medium. And what kind of rules do you have to play by in order to enable that to happen? And they are one of the victims of this kind of problem. Because basically, they want everything to be authorized through authorized links. In other words, no one can ever, as it were, present themselves in Wikipedia as an authority or an expert. So, for example, there's an article about me on Wikipedia, as there is for lots of people. I can't write anything about it. Okay?
You can't correct it.
I can't correct it. I can't do it. No, right, exactly. The only way in which material can be added or enhanced or edited is by citing a source. That is to say, something else that's on the internet that is on some site that Wikipedia regards as authoritative and respectable. And that's not just encyclopedias or university sites or books, but also it includes quite a lot of blogs, but not all blogs. Okay, and one of the interesting things I think that someone in sort of the part of sociology and philosophy that I'm in, which is known as social epistemology, which is about the social foundations of knowledge, it'll be interesting one day to go on Wikipedia, because anyone can do this at the moment, and look at all of the, you might say, judicial decisions that they have, because they have a lot of rulings on whether certain things are allowed in or out, especially once people raise complaints about the way in which certain entries have been designed. And so there's a lot of discussion, very interesting discussion about what counts as authoritative and not authoritative, and how many links back do you have to go, and what is the nature of the source. But at the end of the day, they want to keep it all very textual. Okay? So there's no personal authority at all. It's purely textual authority, citable. That's the ultimate criteria. Verifiable means citable.
So if there is a scientific book of some kind that they accept that says the Loch Ness Monster exists, the Loch Ness Monster item in Wikipedia may allow somebody to say,
well, yes,
monster exists.
Well, that's right. I mean, you can get probably the way the sentence would be phrased, because they have a kind of policy of no point of view, is they will say, this scientist at this university says the Loch Ness Monster exists. And assuming that this book's been published by some respectable press, or it's been in some respectable journal, there'll be a little citation to it, and that could be left standing.
The same way there could be a citation that Elvis Presley is still alive.
If it's from a respectable source. That's the thing, you see, that's the thing. If it's from a respectable source, and you do, in very controversial topics, if you read the Wikipedia entries, you will see lots of sentences where X, Y, and Z say A, and then A, B, and C say not A, and it'll just be left standing.
Well, it takes us to, and this is another area of interest to you, I know, science and society. The equivalent today, for instance, this discussion, we're just coming out of the Copenhagen conference, the discussion about climate change, and the complaint a lot of people have of the fact that those who do not believe in climate change, or that man has anything to do with it, don't get a voice. Mm-hmm. And of course the counterclaim is that they do get a voice, but it's equivalent to how much importance they have, since the vast majority of scientists do accept it. Mm-hmm. So where do you establish priorities?
Yeah. This is a particular problem, I think, because it has policy implications. Because if this were just a straight scientific dispute, where we're asking questions about, is the Earth's atmosphere warming, etc., and there was no policy thinking, in fact, people would be allowed to publish whatever findings they have in whatever journals there are, and as it were, you could do then a survey and say, okay, 85% of scientists believe there is global warming, 15% do not. End of story. Just keep doing the research and let it continue to move along. The reason why this is such a hot button topic is because there is a feeling that one needs to do something about this, one way or the other. Okay, and this, I think, is really the crux of the matter, because in a sense, science always has many different point of views operating at any given time. It's not always 50-50 by any means. Usually there's a dominant view and so forth. But that's okay as long as you don't have to make a decision on it that then commits lots of resources that in a way get taken away from other things and maybe irreversible and so forth. Because when that happens, then the minority voices start to make more of a difference, because it's not merely a matter of whether the Earth's atmosphere is warming up, but whether we want to take these very drastic actions to commit all these billions of dollars for all these years that'll radically change people's lifestyles. Do we believe it's that much, that we're willing to commit that much to it? That's really the question.